So I'm here with Jack Brown. Welcome, Jack.
Hey.
So the topic we're diving into, I'm going to let you say the title of this article because it's definitely it's a long article. It's an important subject, and I have a feeling it's long because you're packing in all these words that are important to it. But what is the topic that we're going over in this episode?
Right. So we're going to be talking about the need for development of a climbing specific fitness battery for youth climbing comparable to other sport specific fitness batteries.
Yeah, hopefully that's good for search engine optimization. You got almost every word related to youth climbing, fitness, and sports. But kind of let's break down that title. So maybe the first part, need for development of a climbing specific fitness battery. For youth climbing? Like,
Mhm.
what does that mean? Like, what is the need to develop that? Where does the need come from?
Yeah. So um, pretty much other sports have a well established system of kind of testing these physiological properties needed for their sport. Climbing, we pretty much are just looking at skill. And when I was in PT school writing this article for the climbing SIG, I was also working as a climbing coach. And I just got frustrated that we weren't really preparing our kids to handle practices, handle competitions. And as a PT student, I became more and more interested in kind of like resilience to injury and things like that. And so, if we test these physiological properties, so like strength, muscular endurance, power, things like that, we can then train them, and then our kids can hopefully reduce that injury risk when we're, training hard.
Got it. Yeah, in this article, as you mentioned, you developed this as part of the climbing special interest group, and that's just a quick background on what that is, or the climbing SIG that Jack mentioned. It's a free special interest group for physical therapy students who are interested in climbing. That Jack was a student in. She's now a teaching assistant and faculty in the group. But where we talk about, learn, go over articles, go through a full process from students all over the country. I think we have this year like 40 students, which is pretty rad. And yeah, Jack, you're killing it in the discussions. Before we
Thank
jumped
you.
on the before we jumped on the episode, I was like, man, you're good at teaching this stuff. You should not only be a physical therapist but also an educator. And I'm excited for you to be educating everyone here on this topic. Now, the second part of it, so this title, need for development of a climbing specific fitness battery for youth climbing, that makes sense. Now, you alluded to the comparable to other sports specific fitness batteries, which is part of this title. But what do you mean for that? Like soccer, football, do all these sports have test batteries that are related to metabolic demands, related to biomechanics?
Yeah, pretty much. I think that it's probably due more to climbing's infancy, especially in like youth climbing's infancy, that we haven't seen more of it. But a lot of youth programs, a lot of strength and conditioning facilities that kind of cater to youth athletes or adolescent athletes have ways that they measure the needs for their athletes to succeed in their sports. So, like soccer, you're thinking about, okay, what do the athletes need to be able to do? Well, when I'm thinking about it, they have to run for a long period of time in short, quick bursts. So, how are we going to test that? And so, in climbing, we don't really have a good way to test getting to like the top of a really hard boulder problem other than just doing the hard boulder problem. So, we need to be better at as coaches, as PTs, as climbers in general, kind of elevating the floor so that we can test these qualities, we can learn how to train them, then we can build resiliency for injury and things like that.
That makes sense. So where do we start? That's the big question, is where do we start? And I think, first of all, from a big picture, I think this article literally is a good start, because you took the time, did the research, figured out what categories. I think the next step from this article is perform the research or have the literature to match it. Oh yes, and you're getting excited about that. But let's dive into it. Why don't you pull up, for those that are viewing, pull up the article, and for those that are listening, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but there'll be a link in the show notes to view the video if you need any kind of references. But we'll just use this as a step-by-step to break things down. And so, yeah, the first question is, where should we start? Like you propose this fitness battery for youth climbers. I assume it's not just for youth climbers. It could be for any climbers, but you pick specific characteristics, that related to youth climbers. So start us off. What should we do? Where do we start?
Yeah. So the first thing that you need to do is see what kind of needs the sport requires. So perform a needs analysis on climbing. And for most climbing coaches or people that are involved in climbing, climbers, everybody should know what you need to do to be able to engage in your sport. So that should be the easiest step. And I've kind of broken it down a little bit as we kind of come down here. But the first step is to kind of identify what are the metabolic or the energy needs of energy needs and energy demands of climbing. So with climbing, we have three big events. So like speed climbing, bouldering, and then sport climbing in youth specific events. And there are great physiological systems that our body naturally does in order to accomplish those three events in climbing anyway. So climbing is really cool that we can kind of express all of those energy demands within different climbing events. So I kind of broke it down here because I'm alluding to these three, but they also align with the bouldering events, like I said. So the first one that we can kind of talk about is the ATP PC system. Lots of P's in there. And we can think about that as more of kind of like short, quick, high intensity movements, often found in like hard boulder problems and speed climbing. As speed climbing becomes quicker and quicker and quicker, more of that kind of like powerful, quick, rapid energy needs to be used. So that's kind of that first system. And then we move through the lactic acid glycolytic system, which is more of a moderate to high intensity. And we can think of this as kind of longer boulder problems and then also sport climbing. And then kind of the last system that I talk about is the aerobic and oxidative system, which is more of a moderate intensity. And then we're thinking about moderate intensity and longer duration. And we're thinking about multi-event days. So, if the youth climbers have to go, it's like qualifiers and then semis, and then the next day is finals because they're all kind of in these like weekend chunks. That's a system that's being utilized kind of like throughout this, like the underlying weekend. And then for climbers who aren't competitive, you can also think of this as more of like a multi-pitch day. So there's a little bit of a spectrum and a sliding scale because the lactic acid glycolytic can also be, a little bit longer boulder problems, and then the aerobic oxidative can be a little bit longer sport climbing. But it's pretty cool how each of those mesh up with each of our main events.
And so I'm assuming that, with that being said, there's at some level those need to be assessed in, in a battery. Like that's the reason why you're bringing them up or mentioning them.
Yes, exactly. Because typically kids also don't specialize in any one event when they're kind of in the development phase. Like everybody's going to end up bouldering and everybody's going to end up sport climbing. Speed climbing is a little bit different of a beast that I don't think I'll get into too much, but we need to assess all of these qualities so we can also determine, okay, if you're really struggling with really high intensity 3 to 4 move boulder problems, how can we support that outside of climbing, like outside of your climbing training, and build essentially a bigger engine for you to be able to produce those moves.
I got it. And so knowing the metabolic energy demands of climbing, also I know in the article you talk about the biomechanical demands, just knowing the biomechanics of climbing, and then also combining that with like what the most common and frequent injuries are.
Mhm.
That seems to be the foundation, like those three things for, building these assessments or this assessment that you did. But is there any other reason or any other background that like we would need, or any other building blocks we would need for creating this assessment?
You need access to like equipment, but really the biggest thing is kind of that injury resilience. So being able to identify these qualities and then train these qualities gives you, like I said, kind of a bigger engine to to be able to go through those moves on the wall, but also it prepares your body in a way to be more resilient if an injury would occur, or um, to prevent an injury to occur.
Okay. So let's say we have kind of all these in the back of our head. We're climbing, someone's a climbing coach or a strength and conditioning specialist or a physical therapist, and they want to develop a standardized test. Are there any other components um, do you need to test power? Is flexibility important? And is strength important? Are there any other aspects that should be overarching themes in testing before we dive into the tests themselves?
Right. Yes. Good point. All of these systems, essentially, how you test them is through testing qualities of power, flexibility, muscular endurance. And so, power is a little bit more associated with kind of that ATP PC system. So, you're going to have to test high intensity, um, quick moving tests. And also, it's important in climbing to not forget about the lower extremities when you're doing this too. So, test power in the upper extremities, test power in the lower extremities. Flexibility is also another important thing for climbers, which I'll get into in the article. Because we're very like front facing, and there can be some nagging muscle imbalances or nagging flexibility imbalances just because of the small range of motion that we're required to go through when we're doing our sport.
Makes sense. All right. Well, should we dive into the assessment, or is there anything else you want to cover? And for those of you watching, we have the kind of article pulled up, and Jack, you can scroll through if there's
Yeah.
any sections of the article you want to jump into
Yeah.
before we get into the testing.
Yeah, so I just really want to highlight kind of I have a little bit of a soapbox to get onto about the common injuries in climbing, specifically for youth athletes, and then also kind of to give a little bit more context to like 6 really good reasons why we should do this. So for injury, and I've kind of made a good point of using the word resiliency, but strength training builds that resiliency. And so, when youth climbers are kind of susceptible to more of like um, uh, when youth climbers are more susceptible to overuse injuries, especially if they have like long practice times or multiple practices a week, we need to be able to make sure that their gas tanks are full and their tissues have the capacity to withstand those practices. And I think it's also important to note that growth plate injuries are more common in youth climbers. Well, they're the ones with growth plates, right? And so identifying kind of who may or may not be a little bit more susceptible uh, based on kind of like strength training and building that resiliency, and just gives coaches a little bit better idea of what to cue into if a kid starts complaining about like a nagging shoulder or a nagging finger. And there's a recent study to support, now it's not climbing specific, but just overall youth athletes, that sports specialization has been associated with an increased injury risk that up to like 37%. And that's in both the acute and the overuse injuries. And then In that same vein, they found, Carter et al. Found that exceeding 16 hours of practice and competition a week increases the injury risk kind of regardless of specialization. So that's just my little soapbox. We need to be able to combat this, and I think that strength training is a really important way that we can start to do that. And the
Yeah,
only
and
way
then
that
maybe climb less volume and maybe do other sports, but have fun telling youth climber and their parents that.
exactly. So along with that, kind of, I outlined 6 reasons for athlete assessment and testing. The first one is to determine the athlete's level of physical preparedness for competition, kind of something that we were talking about the whole way here. Also establish a baseline to assist with exercise prescription. So finding where the athlete is most has the largest deficit, has the largest bucket to fill, and fill that with good supplemental exercise. You can also monitor an athlete's improvement and determine when they're responding adversely to a program. So if all of a sudden they didn't have a naggy shoulder before they were doing some sort of exercise and now they are, let's change something up. Or if they had a stark decrease in their performance at the last competition, maybe they're overtraining, things like that. The more things that we can monitor, the better. And then compare an athlete's score to historical normative data. Climbing is in its infancy too much to really go through and like have a robust amount of historical data, but it's something that we can hope for. And then kind of what I was talking about on my soapbox, predict the potential for success in sport or injury risk, and then recovery from an injury and readiness for return to play and return to competition.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because the same assessment that you're about to go through, or I mean, this assessment's a suggestion that you put together based on your expertise and available research. But any assessment, not only does it answer those first 5 bullet points, but really it can become a return to play competition because it does establish this baseline that you say every athlete on the team has these certain numbers. Okay, let's say you get hurt, get injured. Well, you kind of need to get back to this previous baseline that you're at, so we know your level of performance. So I think it's multifaceted, the importance of these test batteries. And for youth climbers, they probably don't care about the injury component or a lot of those bullet points. What they actually do care is physical preparedness and how good they are at things. And so I think there's probably, from a marketing standpoint, a way that we can convince some youth climbers that these are really cool, fun, exciting tests that they should do, because they'll make them potentially stronger at climbing. But I think all those reasons probably, some parents identify with a few bullet points, some climbers identify with a few, and some coaches identify with a few. And the hardest thing is to get everyone on board and actually do the frickin' test. That's the
Yeah,
tough part.
exactly. So that's why there's the need. Yeah, but it's a good way to kind of test base athleticism. So we'll go into the first round of testing. So I think we've all been at the gym and had, an absolute crusher of a team kid flash our projects. But I guarantee you that you'll be able to jump higher than them. And I think that a lot of kids, when they get off the wall, they have pretty poor movement quality. So that's another thing to like get these assessments on, is how are you moving off of the wall? And a good way to do that is power testing. You can do really easy power testing, max vertical jump, we all have tons of chalk. Put some chalk on a kid's hand and then just try and get as high, encourage them to jump as high as they can and just slap the wall. So zero equipment is needed. Well, zero extra equipment is needed. And you can do a really easy power test just there. It also turns into a really good competition. So all the kids are trying to, get a higher hand slap. I think that's base one, a great test. You can do upper extremity tests, like using a medicine ball to kind of throw a far distance. There's not a ton of good research in the climbing world. Baseball has some good stuff, especially using radar guns. But for kids, I think that the jumping and the hand slap is great. If you're if you're like a little bit older and have been deemed appropriate to do some campus boarding, there are some things that like a climbing coach can make a decision on whether or not like, oh, we're going to use this as the standard for maybe our advanced team, kind of doing like a 135 or something. And then I also want to kind of highlight continuous tests or interval tests, sprint tests. They're also tests of power and metabolic conditioning. So a continuous test kind of submaximally on auto belays or, traversing would be a great way to make this more climbing specific. But I think that if you just get all your team kids to sprint as hard as they can, like an all out sprint for a certain distance, like 40 meters, something like that, it's a good baseline. How fast are you? And it's also, sprinting is a well supported movement to develop power. And climbers, like I said, great on the wall, but that horizontal power, so like kind of going in a horizontal movement, that's going to be where a lot of their kind of movement deficits would be. And then flexibility, like Jared had mentioned earlier, we need more, hip mobility, more shoulder mobility, more thoracic mobility than probably a lot of other youth sports, just because we're very squared on the wall a lot and we have to kind of move around this big frontal plane blocker. So a test that I learned about in the climbing SIG was this adapted Grant foot raise. And I think that that's a really great tool that climbing coaches can easily implement to just get a little bit of an idea of where like hip mobility is. And it's pretty climbing specific. It's very climbing specific.
Yeah, it's super easy to do. You put 2 pieces of tape on the wall, you slide your toe up the wall, and you see how high you can high step. And the challenge, I think one challenge with that test is normalizing it for limb length. But you do have to like measure, everyone's limb length and then compare. But yeah, it's a really easy one to do.
Yeah. I do it in the clinic a bunch too. I do it on non-climbers as well. It's just it's a good way to see kind of like lower body flexibility. So those are the 3 kind of easy implemented tests. And, we need to think about now, okay, how are we organizing it into more of a standardized battery? So for this article, I organized it into a 2-day testing schedule. Do it at the beginning of the season just to kind of get any sort of baseline measurement. And there should be some thought behind how to organize it, like what tests go on what days. And just to highlight that, the testing order should follow non-fatiguing tests. So any sort of like body composition or flexibility, so like the adapted Grant foot raise, that should go at the top of your list. Just get all that done right away. And then maximum power.
That's the one sliding the foot up the wall, because that's a flexibility test, right?
Yes. And the maximum power and strength testing. So that would be our vertical jumps or even like a broad jump, that horizontal distance again. And then one rep max testing for kiddos. I go on in the article to kind of recommend a 3 or a 5, but you can also do a 10 rep max testing just to get a gross understanding of how much weight somebody can move in a functional movement. So like a squat or a deadlift.
And you just don't want 1 rep max just because that potentially may be stressing their system too much.
Exactly. It's super neuro fatiguing. And also if somebody's never trained, the risk to reward ratio is not great. So just train them up. And then we'll move on to kind of like that sprint testing. And then local muscular endurance, which would be pull-ups, push-ups, anything that they need to do for more than 10 reps or a max amount of reps. And then aerobic capacity, which would be kind of our like continuous climbing that I alluded to earlier as well.
Got it. So everyone now like listening or watching, you should have the background for like the why. Like, why do we need to do this? You should have the background for maybe the different components that play a role in it, the metabolic energy demands, the biomechanics, what common injuries. You should have a bunch of reasons why we should do it. You should have an order, a sequence, all that stuff. And now it's the what. Like, what are you actually going to do? And Jack, you put together specific components. I think it's really hard to have like the best possible recipe, and um, you know, finding the right equipment, finding the things that match the youth climbers, all those different aspects. But why don't you break down what you chose? And I may ask some questions maybe about whys, and then I'll have in the show notes a reference, because some of this stuff's like hard to explain
Hmm.
without a video, right? And so
Yeah.
it's like lie on your back and bring your arm above the air and make sure to, well, let's, maybe someone can go and they can look on the webpage and see what that video is. But let's dive into maybe some of the key tests that you find are important, and maybe we can see why they're in there.
Right. Great. So it's important first to standardize your warm up. So typically, I would have somebody do jumping jacks, jogging for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then 3 to 5 minutes of dynamic stretching. So not static stretching. Um, we want to do cat cows and half kneeling hip flexor stretches, arm circles, things like that, things that prepare our body to do movement rather than just like sitting in a position. So that takes up the first 6 to 10 minutes of what your day one should look like. And then after that, get the kids climbing, like 10 to 15 minutes, climbing specific movements. You're also warming up movements that you're going to have to test, um, or, qualities that you're going to have to test. So let them on the wall, go through that. And then after that warm up's done, so that's like a, 15 to 25-minute warm up, then I would move into flexibility testing. I included in my assessment more of like a general movement screen or a quality of movement screen. This is something that I just have, like, this is something I run people through day to day at the clinic too when I'm doing an eval. So look at how they squat, look at how they lunge, look at how they hinge, and then also do a push up.
Yeah, I like that. So the kids are nice and warm. They're actually on the wall, so they get some energy out on there, get some specific movement patterns going. You do a nice kind of generalized movement screen. And then flexibility tests. I'm assuming upper body, lower body, you need a test for each, right?
Yeah,
At
yeah.
least.
So I like a easy latissimus dorsi flexibility stretch or flexibility test. It's easy to do. Have them lie on the ground. There's a video of me doing it on the website, and you just measure whether or not they can get their elbow to the ground and see. Okay, that's like the muscle length of the lats, and then so that's your upper body, and then your lower body is the adapted grant foot raise that we talked about too. The video is up as well for people to look at, but do both sides. It's really important just to get a good upper quarter, lower quarter idea.
Yeah, and for lats, I assume that's important because that's, as you're reaching, if your lats are stiff, the climber may arch their back, they may lose core tension, they may compensate through their shoulder. And then for the lower body, if you can't lift your leg very high, maybe they'll round their back, or their knee will flare out, and you have a nice kind of top down and bottom up flexibility assessment. All right, so now we've gone through flexibility assessments. Day one, the kids are getting antsy because they've been lying around. They're like, all right, what do I do next? What's next on the list?
Squat, deadlift, pull up. The kids are going to want to do a pull up, so I say put it at the end. This is where we would do, a 3 to 5 rep max or a 10 rep max, depending on how trained the kids are. Have them warm up, do their movement, rest for a minute, try and put a little bit more weight on, rest for a minute. Do only about 2 to 3 attempts, and then, see what weight they got. And then this is a great one, like do it again in 6 weeks and see what weight they get. The pull-ups would be amount of like added weight that you can add to a pull-up, but I wouldn't recommend doing that unless the kids can do more than 10 pull-ups. And then I also like a maximal finger strength test, or, added weight to just holding on to a comfy edge. It's a good way, don't do this with everybody. This is more of like advanced team suggestions, right? They're already like well-trained fingers, but a 22 millimeter edge with anywhere from like 5 to 10% of their body weight added is a good place to start, and then see how long they can hold on to that for about like 10 seconds.
So you have your max strength testing of like your large muscles, squat, deadlift, pull up, kind of full body. Then you dial it into the fingers, which is just isometric hang. And is that everything for strength? Is strength now like check mark?
Yeah, big check mark for strength. I think that's
Okay.
that's all the strength that we really need to take from them. But I do like to do power on the same day as well. And so then you go right into power. So this is when the kids can, they're antsy. They've lifted a bunch of weight.
Yeah, you thought you'd fatigue them out by like lifting heavy weights, but they're like jumping around. They're like, let's keep going.
Exactly. And then you just, do that nice little chalk on the wall. So you slap it up there. So that vertical jump test. Now, this can be put on a separate day. It's going to kind of be a little bit up to discretion of the coach and the conditions that you're in and how long this testing is taking. But there's nothing bad about having the kids jump high, slap the wall. That's their last test, basically.
They're kids. It's crazy. Like I would be tired after flexibility testing. I'd be like, all right, that's my stretches for the day. Can we do strength testing tomorrow? And the kids are just like jumping around, like getting on the wall, climbing in between like all your testing intervals. So, all right. So you have them do a vertical jump test. That's going to test lower leg power. I have to imagine you have some type of upper body power test, but we don't have anything great. Like, what are you using? I think you use the medicine ball chest pass, or
medicine ball chest pass. You can do, you can write down the number of how far they threw it. I don't like a plyo push up. I don't think that that's really necessary for us, but we have to do dynamic movements and kind of launch off of our legs when we're doing dynos. So vertical jump test is going to check that box.
What about like an arm jump test or a power slap where they're like hanging from 2 jugs on a campus board and they do like a rapid kind of pull up, like an upper body campus dyno and slap? Is that like too aggressive for kids, and that maybe save that for later on in life?
That sounds like a really interesting thing to test. I think
we can add an edit. We can add an addendum maybe as an option. I mean, I think they've done some research study on that. They've normalized it. Now these are for adults. But it is, I don't know. It is like a little hard to set up. And if you're thinking about like setting up all these tests, there's a bit of a barrier to entry to like get the right angle, get your measurements, versus like it's way easier to just put some tape on the wall and do that Grant foot raise. But that may be an interesting one for upper body plyo. But I like the medicine ball one also, because I know it's not like that. Pushing is not really a climbing movement unless you're like maybe power mantling or something. But it is like a lot of indication of core strength and ability too. And especially if you're doing that from like a seated position, the ability to generate trunk power. I still think it's a valid test, and I have to imagine it's kind of fun to just see how far the ball gets thrown, for the kids.
Yeah,
But
the more competition, the more better with these guys.
yeah. So, all right, is that day one? I'm like tired just reading this. So, are we good with day one, or is there more?
Yeah, no, day one, that's totally done. And that's pretty much the bulk of any of the like supplemental testing that you're going to want to do anyway. So that's going to give you a really good idea of what exercises that we need to, or what buckets we need to fill, and how we can fill those buckets with certain exercises. Day two is more of a climbing specific movement day. So that's more of that's sport specific. keeping the same warm up though. So still 3 to 5 minutes of kind of that light cardio, jumping jacks, jogging, something like that. 3 to 5 minutes of dynamic stretching, and then get the kids on the wall again for 10 to 15 minutes before you look at maybe how they're doing a drop knee or flagging or mantling or, stemming, more of these higher level climbing moves that maybe your, level ones aren't doing, but level threes, level fours, your advanced kids are going to do.
And are these screens, are these on the wall, or are they doing this on the ground? Are they like, mantling off like, a chair on the ground? Or is this all, no, you're actually literally on the climbing wall?
Yeah, on the climbing wall. And then, because kids are going to climb, you need to see how they're climbing. And then what I like to do is when kind of coaches can see, oh, this is like this kid has trouble reaching X amount to get this hold, or they, decide to catch something in a different way. It's like, oh, well, their lat muscle length, their lat flexibility wasn't that great. Maybe that's why. Maybe that's supporting why we need to improve the team's lat flexibility.
Got it. So they're then you're applying for the whole or you're like, oh, I have 7 kids who couldn't do this. Well, maybe now this is something we need for everyone. I just want to clarify the on the wall. So is it like you set up like a V4 boulder problem or something that has a mantle and you're like, all right, everyone mantle on this? Or do you just say, oh, just freestyle climb, rainbow everything and throw in a mantle and let's see how that looks? Like, how does this, I'm trying to imagine because I don't know, take your A team and your B team and maybe you do like a V4 and a V8, right? And you kind of see where they're at. But yeah, kind of paint the picture of what that looks like.
Yeah. In my mind, I would hope that the climbing coaches would have, talked to the setters and they would have established hopefully like 3 to 5 problems that can be scaled for any of the kids on the team. And so that would involve hopefully a pretty mantly shouldery move, and then a couple of boulders that are going to force a drop knee on both knees. So that involves a lot of conversation between, the setters and then the climbing coaches as well. But if that's not an option at your facility, you can set the routes yourself or, like mark the holds with tape that you want your kids to go through and more of that like rainbow style, like you were saying.
Gotcha. Anything else day 2?
Well, the last thing is just endurance testing. So I would have kids either traverse the whole way of the gym and see how many laps they can do, kind of back and forth, or jump on those auto belays. All
And
the
then
time.
how do you do that from a time standpoint? Like, do you just like follow the leader and then when they have to go back the other way, everyone, all right, now we're reversing.
Yeah,
And it's just
exactly.
like this like caterpillar train.
Yeah, caterpillar trait. That's perfect. And like it can be also a little bit fun for kids to try and like climb up and then climb, over somebody. So it's all about keeping it fun too. And the climbing stuff is going to be more apparent and more addressable during climbing practice. We're just trying to fill all these buckets.
So here's the question, like how I'm assuming you've done this or you've done components of it, with the climbers and like if the coaches are listening or someone's listening to like try and put together a youth battery or even a PT is listening, it's like, oh, I want to screen, a climbing team and get some information from this. Can someone take this and be like, let me just choose a couple greatest hits and like pick a few components? Or do you have to do the whole thing? Is the first question. And the second question, is there anything else missing? So those are like our 2 levels is,
Yeah.
can you trim it down a little bit and then can you add to it?
Absolutely. So the biggest thing, it's definitely this whole thing is scalable. So the biggest thing I want is that the kids can move on the ground as well as they can move on the wall. So absolutely you need to do that general flexibility and movement quality screen. That would be my number 1. And then I would hope that there's also some component of just strength testing. So if it's you have a 25-pound dumbbell, you're holding it in a goblet position, and everybody does 10 squats, and let's see how that looks, that's totally fine as well. That you can probably wrap up in 20 to 30 minutes with a whole line of kids. The power testing, we can fill that bucket a little bit later, but if if we want to strength train, we have to at least assess strength to some level.
Got it. Well, Jack, this is awesome. I think the next step is we have to run some research on this test,
Yeah.
or this battery. But any final words? Any closing components for people listening and watching?
Um, just that like strength training builds resilience. So we absolutely need to be good at our sport, but we can't do our sport unless we have the tissue capacity to be able to do our sport. And that is done in the weight room. And I want to see less climbers on my table in my clinic. So just get squatting, do your pull-ups, get strength training.
Bad business model for PTs, but a good overall goal for the climbing community. Well, Jack, thanks for coming on. Excited for this topic. And where can people find you? Can they find you on social media? Can they find you anywhere?
Yeah, my social media is dr.jack_DPT. I'm on Instagram. I think my email is somewhere in the bio, but Instagram is probably the best way to reach out to me. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Sounds great. Thank you.
All right.